Welcome back to History They Buried, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows of seemingly ordinary lives. Today we dive into a case that will make you question the very foundations of what we call family. This is the macabre history of the Higgins family, a respectable household in the heart of rural England, whose sudden disappearance in 1965 revealed a far more disturbing truth than anyone in the village could admit. It began with silence. Not a scream, not a struggle, not even the rustle of a closing door. Just an eerie stillness that wrapped itself around the village of Ashworth one bitter December morning. Birds didn't sing that day. The pub opened late, and the wind, usually sharp and whistling through the hedgerows, was dead still. At first, no one thought anything of it, until the milkman, John Leary, noticed the Higgins' doorstep was oddly untouched. 4 bottles of milk, lined neatly as always, but now with thin sheets of frost hugging the glass. No empty ones returned, no footprints in the snow, just that row of glass bottles catching the morning light. By midday, neighbors were exchanging looks over garden fences. By nightfall, a constable was inside the Higgins home with a torchlight and trembling hands. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. The beds had been slept in, but never made. A casserole dish sat cold on the counter, half-eaten, covered loosely with foil. The radio was still on in the corner, humming static. Margaret's knitting sat mid-row on the armrest. The Sunday paper was laid open to the crossword. But the family, all 6 of them, were gone, without a trace. No signs of struggle, no luggage missing, no goodbye. And yet, something felt off. Something the constable couldn't explain. The walls felt too close. The air smelled like damp stone, though the fire had been lit just yesterday. And on the hallway mirror, someone, perhaps one of the children, had drawn a crude spiral in the condensation, left untouched. It wasn't just the vanishing that disturbed the village. It was what they began to remember afterward. The strange things the Higgins family had said, the odd symbols chalked near their doorstep, the way the children stopped making eye contact, the sermons, the midnight lights in the church. Before we continue with the story and its unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers, and tell me in the comments, what part of the UK are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? Because this story doesn't begin with a disappearance. It begins with a village that saw the signs and turned away. The diary was found tucked behind a loose floorboard in the eldest daughter's bedroom. Lydia Higgins, age 14, faded green leather cracked along the spine. Her name was inked on the inside cover alongside a childish drawing of the family cottage, but what lay inside was no ordinary teenage rambling. The first few pages were harmless, mentions of school, her younger brother's tantrums, how cold the village had been that autumn, but as the entries moved closer to December 1965, the tone changed. They grew scattered, paranoid, even afraid. Mum won't stop whispering to herself in the garden. She thinks I'm asleep, but I saw her draw a circle in the soil. Just stood there in the cold. Didn't move for an hour. Father keeps locking the cellar door. He says it's damp, but I heard voices coming from down there. It's not the pipes. And then an entry dated just 5 days before the family vanished. I asked Reverend Clark why we don't celebrate Christmas anymore. He looked straight through me and said, "Some gifts come with a cost, child. Best to be thankful in silence." I don't like his eyes. Tucked between those final pages was a torn scrap of paper. A drawing, obviously done by a child, of 6 stick figures standing around a large spiral. One of the figures was upside down. Above them, hanging in the sky like a dark sun, was a symbol none of the local police could identify. Not at first. What made the drawing more disturbing was what was written on the back. Scrawled in what appeared to be red pencil, in a hand far less stable than Lydia's, were the words, "They chose us." At first, the local constable dismissed it as the disturbed mind of a teenage girl, but the lead investigator, Sergeant Len Henley, wasn't convinced. He'd seen symbols like that spiral before, during a training course with Scotland Yard years prior in a unit that studied historical cue behavior. It wasn't just a spiral, it was a protection ward, twisted from ancient British folklore, often associated with sacrificial rituals meant to cleanse a community. But who had Lydia been drawing with? And what had the family been chosen for? The deeper Sergeant Henley dug, the more the village resisted. Ashworth wasn't the sort of place that welcomed questions, especially not from outsiders. People stopped answering their doors. The vicar went on a sudden sabbatical, and neighbors who had known the Higginses for decades suddenly claimed they barely interacted. There was fear in their silence. Fear and guilt. Next, we meet the village's trusted leader, Reverend Clark, and we begin to unravel the strange sermons and ancient rites whispered beneath St. Mary's Church. If you ask anyone over the age of 60 in Ashworth about Reverend Clark, they'll lower their voice, or change the subject entirely. Tall, gentle-spoken, and immaculately dressed, Reverend Malcolm Clark served St. Mary's for over 25 years. To an outsider, he was the image of quiet, country clergy, but there was something about him that felt rehearsed. His smile never reached his eyes, and he rarely blinked. He arrived in Ashworth in 1940, just before the end of the war. No one remembers where he came from. His papers were clean, his references were vague, but he was kind to the children and spoke softly from the pulpit, quoting obscure scripture and weaving in lessons about sacrifice, order, and removing rot from the garden of God. The congregation nodded along. Most didn't really listen. Until around 1951, when something shifted. Church attendance dropped suddenly, and those who did still attend described the sermons as unsettling. A handful of families left the village entirely. No announcement, no forwarding address. Clark stopped using the traditional Bible and began reading from a worn black leather-bound text with no visible title. When questioned, he would smile and say, "It's older than you know, a purer truth." One parishioner, Agnes Barlow, now 91, living in a care home in Yorkshire, recalled a sermon just 2 years before the Higginses vanished. He spoke of blood and birthright, said the village had gone soft, that we needed to wake the stone beneath us. Everyone just sat there, nodding. I looked around and thought, am I the only one who hears how mad this is? But no one challenged Clark, not publicly, not ever. And then there were the special services. Held once every season, always at night, always by invitation only. Lights off, doors locked. Chants could be heard through the heavy wood, but no one admitted to attending. When villagers were asked, even years later, they denied everything, or said they were out of town, or simply stared back and said, "Some things are best left alone." Sergeant Henley tried to interview Clark, drove out to the vicarage himself. But when he arrived, the Reverend was gone. The study had been emptied, records burned in the fireplace, pews in the chapel overturned. A circle of ash marked the altar. Whatever was kept there, whatever had been read there, was gone. Clark had vanished, just like the Higginses. Except one thing remained. Etched into the inside of the chapel door, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "The offering is complete. The gate will hold." Next, we descend into the hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's and uncover the chilling relics that connect the Reverend, the Higgins family, and something far older than Ashworth itself. St. Mary's Church stood like a stone sentinel at the edge of Ashworth. Weather-beaten and ivy-covered, it had watched over the village for centuries. Most believed it was built in the 1700s, but Sergeant Henley's investigation revealed something far older beneath its foundations. A small maintenance hatch behind the altar, hidden behind stacked hymnals and false paneling, led to a steep spiral staircase. Dust coated every surface, and the air was damp, metallic, almost sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with rust. At the bottom was a door, oak, reinforced, ancient. Someone had scratched deep grooves into the wood, as if clawing to get out. When the forensic team forced it open, what they found defied logic. The chamber was circular, no more than 20 feet across, lit only by natural cracks in the stone ceiling above. In the center, embedded into the floor, was a shallow basin, blackened by something long soaked in. On the walls were carvings, symbols, spirals, eyes, repeating motifs of hands held open and mouths stitched shut. But what truly stopped the investigators cold were the personal items. Laid out around the basin were children's toys, handmade dolls, worn shoes, a set of wooden teeth, a baby's bonnet, stained dark, and one item that made Sergeant Henley leave the room, a hand-sewn patch bearing the initials LH stitched in blue. Lydia Higgins. DNA testing later confirmed that several of the items belonged to the Higgins children, but that wasn't the most disturbing part. There were dozens of items, and they didn't all belong to the Higgins family. Local police began re-examining cold cases, and slowly, a terrifying picture emerged. Ashworth had a history of missing persons stretching back decades. Most were dismissed at the time, vagrants, runaways, drifters passing through. But now, in the cold light of forensic science, many of these cases were linked by one shared detail. They had all vanished within a 2-mile radius of St. Mary's Church. And the chamber? It had no known architectural record. Not even the diocese had it on file. Some experts speculated it dated back to pre-Christian times. A chalk cult site, possibly repurposed by early settlers, then later by the church. But its purpose remained unclear. That is, until they found the ledger. Bound in human skin, confirmed via analysis, the small book was hidden in a bricked alcove behind the basin. Written in a language that linguists struggle to identify, parts were eventually translated. It contained dates, names, ritual instructions, and most chilling of all, a recurring phrase: "We give so the soil stays still." Next, we uncover the hidden society behind Ashworth's most powerful families, and their twisted vow to keep the village clean at any cost. After the discovery beneath St. Mary's, Sergeant Henley focused his attention on the town's power structure, specifically the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society. To outsiders, it was a harmless, elderly-run group that organized flower shows and helped maintain old buildings. They hosted bake sales, ran the village fete, and produced a yearly heritage booklet. But Henley found something disturbing in their records, or rather, in what wasn't recorded. There were no founding documents, no bank trail before 1962, no clear explanation as to who officially ran it. And yet, it owned almost half the properties in Ashworth. Manor homes, farmland, even St. Mary's Church, all listed under shell names connected to the society. Members included the local doctor, headmistress, bank manager, and perhaps most disturbingly, former Chief Constable Reginald Vaughan, who had once been Henley's superior. It was Vaughan's quiet retirement, following his refusal to investigate the Higgins disappearance further, that had first raised Henley's suspicions. Now it made sense. Henley obtained an anonymous tip-off pointing him to the society's private archive room, hidden beneath the town library. With a warrant and a trusted team, he entered the space just after midnight. What they uncovered shook even the most hardened officers. Over 50 boxes of handwritten records, many in Latin and Old English, catalogued names, dates, rituals, and something called the tithe of the soil. Each decade, an offering was required. Not always a person, sometimes livestock, but increasingly from 1924 onwards, the entries turned darker. Children, always from outside the bloodline. One document dated 1965, the year the Higgins family vanished, but read, The soil beneath St. Mary's trembles, the harvest weakens, a full family shall be returned to the root, blooded and bound. But it wasn't just text. There were photographs. One black and white image showed Reverend Clark in ceremonial robes, standing beside what appeared to be a wooden altar. In the background, the Higgins twins, eyes vacant, hands bound. Another showed a group of 12 people, all in formal wear, faces solemn, standing around an open stone basin. Several were recognizable. Others bore a terrifying resemblance to known Ashworth families still living there. The society wasn't just involved, they were running the entire show. From within the respectable heart of the village, behind lace curtains and charity work, a hidden council had maintained control for decades, enforcing rituals that dated back to before the Norman conquest, and every single one of them had sworn an oath. We preserve, so the ground stays quiet. Next, we follow Sergeant Henley as he risks everything, his career, safety, and sanity, to confront the people he once called neighbors, and expose the monstrous truth buried in Ashworth's roots. Sergeant Henley knew what he was stepping into. In a village like Ashworth, you don't go digging into your neighbors unless you're prepared for what might crawl out. After the archive discovery, he requested immediate backup from county authorities, but his requests were delayed, mysteriously, repeatedly. He later learned the files he submitted had been flagged and held under pending verification. Someone higher up was slowing things down. So Henley did something no one expected. He went public. He contacted a regional journalist, a woman named Claire Merrick, known for her fearless reporting on rural corruption. He shared photographs, ledger translations, and even recordings of his interviews with past Ashworth residents who'd fled the village over the years. Many spoke of strange church gatherings, unexplained disappearances, and a suffocating silence that blanketed anyone who asked too many questions. Within 48 hours, Claire's article hit the front page of the Yorkshire Sentinel under the headline, "The Rituals of Ashworth. Did a village hide a century of sacrifice?" It exploded. National media latched onto the story. TV crews descended on the village. The church was sealed off, and within days, villagers began whispering names, people they'd always found off, stories they'd heard but never dared speak aloud. That's when Henley's life turned. His car was vandalized. His wife received an anonymous note reading, "The roots are deep, and so is your grave." He was suspended from duty pending a formal review, but the attention was now too great to bury. A public inquiry was opened. Survivors came forward. One by one, former members of the Preservation Society were brought in for questioning. Then came the break. A man in his 80s, Edwin Marlowe, confessed. Once the village undertaker, he had witnessed the 1965 ritual. He described in chilling detail how the Higgins family had been prepared, dressed in white linen, and led to the underground chamber. But his most disturbing revelation? The sacrifice had not been the first, nor the last. "Every decade," he said, voice trembling, "we gave them to the ground. Families, orphans, foundlings, always chosen, always agreed upon, and we were told, if we stopped, the land would rot and death would come tenfold." His confession triggered a series of arrests. Vaughan, Clark, and several other prominent figures were charged with conspiracy, ritual murder, and obstruction of justice, but most of them died, some by suicide, others under suspicious natural circumstances, before the trials began. Still, Henley's work cracked the wall of silence. The press called it the Ashworth Pact. For the first time, the truth had a voice. Next, we trace the origins of the cult, and how its ancient roots stretch back further than anyone dared believe, even to the days when Ashworth was first founded. As media interest intensified and public horror grew, historians and occult scholars descended on Ashworth, eager to uncover the deeper origins of the so-called Preservation Society. What they found sent ripples through both academic and law enforcement communities. Ashworth, it turned out, was never an ordinary village. It was built on a boundary, not just between counties, but between pagan and Christian Britain. Long before churches were erected, the land had been home to an ancient Druidic settlement known in pre-Roman records as Iceworth, meaning the place of the ash sacrifice. The name had changed over centuries, but the rituals hadn't. Deep beneath the current church, beneath even the chamber where the Higgins family was taken, archaeologists discovered a much older stone structure, carbon dated to over 1,000 years ago. At its center was a circular stone table, blackened by centuries of soot, surrounded by crude carvings of trees, roots, and chained human figures. It wasn't a church. It was a temple. Records found in a nearby manor house, written in early Middle English, told of a pact made between village elders and a keeper beneath the soil, a force believed to protect the land from blight, plague, and war in exchange for offerings. These offerings were originally animals, but after the Black Death swept through Britain in the 14th century, the pact was rewritten. The land must drink that which thinks, one entry read, "In blood of kin and stranger shall the soil know peace." Even after the village Christianized, the tradition endured, but went underground. The Preservation Society, it turned out, was only the latest name for a long line of secret orders tasked with maintaining the ritual. From 1437 to the present day, the names had changed, but the purpose remained chillingly consistent. Keep Ashworth quiet. Keep the land fed. Keep outsiders blind. What shook investigators most was just how institutionalized this system had become. Each generation trained the next. Births, adoptions, marriages, all were influenced by the society, ensuring loyalty through blood and fear. And those who resisted, they simply vanished. Henley, still under suspension but now a media hero, was granted access to a sealed archive within the Royal Historical Society. Inside were correspondence letters from 1862 between local lords and clergy, casually discussing this year's tithe and ensuring the chosen don't awaken suspicion. Ashworth's rot wasn't a recent infection. It had always been there. Next, we returned to the Higgins family and uncovered chilling new evidence suggesting they were not simply victims, but chosen for reasons far more sinister than anyone realized. At first glance, the Higgins family seemed like victims of random fate, outsiders who stumbled into a place they never truly belonged. But as investigators traced their arrival in Ashworth, a chilling pattern began to emerge. They weren't just chosen, they were invited. According to land records from 1962, the family moved into a cottage owned by the church, not the council, leased directly to them by Reverend Clark himself for a token amount. Even stranger, the position offered to Edward Higgins, a supposed groundskeeper post at St. Mary's Church, had never been publicly listed. He was offered the job by name. Digging deeper, Sergeant Henley found adoption files for the Higgins' two younger children, files that were altered, redacted, and ultimately traced back to an agency connected to a long-defunct Catholic orphanage in Sussex. The trail ran cold until a retired administrator came forward anonymously. She confirmed that the Higgins' adopted children were part of a selective placement initiative run quietly in the 1950s and 60s, where certain families were matched with children of particular temperament and background for small rural communities. On paper, it sounded benign, even charitable. But what she described next was anything but. There was a list, she said, an internal list with villages flagged as preservation zones. If you saw one of those names, Ashworth, Hartmoor, Grendale, it meant the child's placement wasn't just about home and care, it was about purpose. That purpose: to quietly deliver certain children into communities that still followed the old ways. Suddenly the pieces clicked. The Higgins family, with their mix of biological and adopted children, their isolation from extended relatives, their eager involvement with the church, they weren't just ideal sacrifices. They were deliberately constructed to be a sacrifice. This revelation horrified even the most hardened investigators. It suggested a multi-agency collusion, church, state, and orphanage systems working together to fulfill the needs of communities like Ashworth, all under the guise of faith and charity. As Henley put it in a leaked internal memo, the Higgins weren't random. They were designed, groomed, positioned, and once their usefulness was complete, erased. Public reaction was swift and furious. Inquiries were launched into adoption records across the UK. Survivors from other flagged villages began coming forward, sharing stories of strange ceremonies, missing children, and churches that held late-night prayers behind locked doors. The rot was deeper than anyone imagined. But there was more to the Higgins story. In the final weeks before their disappearance, something changed in them. Behavior that even the society hadn't anticipated. Next, we dive into the strange final days of the Higgins family, and the chilling signs that one of them may have uncovered the truth too late. By August 1965, something had shifted inside the Higgins household. Neighbors described it as a cloud passing over their cottage. Smiles turned strained. Church attendance became erratic. The youngest daughter, 8-year-old Eliza, was seen weeping on the church steps after Sunday service. When Mrs. Cartwright, their closest neighbor, asked what was wrong, the girl whispered, "They're coming for us. Daddy knows." What followed were a series of increasingly bizarre sightings. Edward Higgins was seen digging behind the church late at night, unearthing something before quickly covering it again. 2 of the older boys were spotted burning family photo albums in the garden. Mary Higgins, once the heart of Ashworth's women's group, began appearing at community meetings with bruises on her arms and vacant eyes, speaking only when spoken to. Then there was the journal. Hidden in the base of a wooden toy chest, it was discovered years later during a forensic sweep of their abandoned home. Though many pages were damaged by time and damp, a few remained intact. They were written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, and the entries, presumably by Edward, grew darker by the day. They lied. This was never about faith. The prayers are old, older than the Bible. Mary says we have to play along, but I see it in their eyes. They've chosen us. The children are having the dreams again. Eliza screams in her sleep. James says a man in robes comes to the window. I told them it's just a nightmare, but I've seen him too. It's not just the church, it's the schoolmaster, the baker, even the constable. I trusted these people. The most disturbing entry came just 5 days before the family vanished. They've warned us. The last offering failed. If we don't comply, it will be worse. I asked Mary if she'd run. She shook her head and said, "It's already too late. I don't know what to do." But I buried the first one deep. That last sentence, "I buried the first one deep," would haunt investigators for years. What or who was he referring to? Police excavations later uncovered a small skeleton wrapped in cloth behind the church garden, just as witnesses had described. The remains belonged to a child, female, age estimated at 3 or 4. There were no missing children reported in Ashworth from that time, which raised an even more terrifying possibility. Was this not the first sacrifice involving the Higgins family? Had they been involved, unwillingly or not, in earlier rituals, perhaps manipulated into believing it would spare them? Next, we enter the night of the Higgins' final appearance, the harvest vigil, and the unspeakable horror witnessed by a single child who survived, September 3rd, 1965. Ashworth's annual harvest vigil was meant to be a quaint, rural affair. Held under the old oak trees near St. Mary's Church, it combined hymns, cider, and stories of gratitude for the year's yield, but that year it felt off. The air was unusually still, the trees didn't move, and the Higgins family, for the first time in months, arrived together. Witnesses would later recall their appearance with unease. Mary in a grey shawl, eyes sunken and blank. Edward, gaunt and silent, gripping a child on either side. The children wore identical linen garments, odd considering the chilly air, and none of them spoke, not once. The entire village attended. Even those who rarely came out were there, but this wasn't just a vigil. This was something older. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the Reverend took the podium, but instead of his usual sermon on gratitude, he opened a weathered black book, not the Bible, and began reading in a language no one could quite place. Low, rhythmic chanting followed, then humming, and then silence. A circle formed. The Higgins children were ushered forward, calmly, obediently, like they had practiced it. Mary stood still. Edward looked as though he might speak, but didn't. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the woods behind the church, a long, haunted look that would be his last. Because moments later, the candles were blown out. What happened next has been pieced together from the only surviving witness, a 14-year-old boy named Samuel Lorne, who had hidden beneath one of the cider carts after being dared by schoolmates. He saw everything. According to Samuel, once the candles went out, the crowd began chanting again, louder this time. Then came the bells, but not from the chapel. These were deep metallic tolls coming from somewhere beneath the earth, the kind you feel more than hear, through gaps in wooden slats. Samuel saw the children being led in pairs toward the church's rear entrance, not through the doors but around the back, where the old root cellar lay hidden beneath ivy and stone. He watched as Edward hesitated, looked back toward Mary, and then vanished behind the church wall. And that was the last time the Higgins family was seen alive. By morning, the entire family, mother, father, and all 4 children, were gone. The official explanation? They moved. No forwarding address, no questions asked. But Samuel never forgot what he saw, and as he grew older he began documenting it all, drawings, notes, maps, until decades later he handed it to someone willing to listen, Sergeant Henley. Next, we follow Henley as he begins to dig beneath St. Mary's Church, and discovers a chamber untouched by sunlight for centuries. Sergeant Graham Henley didn't believe in superstition. A by-the-book investigator with 19 years of service, he considered the Higgins disappearance tragic, perhaps a murder-suicide or a case of rural cult delusion. But when he held Samuel Lorne's maps in his hand, something changed. The drawings were crude but precise. He'd marked the exact location behind St. Mary's where the family disappeared. More disturbingly, he'd labeled it the Mouth. Henley requested a discreet dig behind the church. Permission was denied. Official records showed nothing unusual. No root cellar, no old crypts, no mouth. Still, something about Samuel's conviction stayed with him. So he returned alone, late one October evening. Armed with nothing more than a torch, crowbar, and a quiet prayer, Henley moved through thick ivy and stone. Just where the boy's map indicated, he found something odd, a patch of ground that sounded hollow beneath his feet. He dug. Beneath 3 feet of soil, he found it, a sealed stone door, overgrown but unmistakably man-made. The markings around it were not Christian. No crosses, no familiar inscriptions, instead spirals, interlocked eyes, a twisted sigil carved repeatedly into the stone like a warning or curse. Henley broke the seal. The air that escaped was ancient, still, and cold. What lay below was not a cellar. It was a ritual chamber. The steps descended steeply, 20 feet into the ground. The walls were lined with crumbling masonry and, chillingly, bone fragments embedded in candle wax. Dust choked the air, but the space was wide enough to hold at least 30 people. At the center sat a stone table, stained dark and worn smooth by time. Surrounding it were rusted chains bolted into the ground and a circle of blackened wax stumps. This wasn't just a hidden room. This was a place of ceremony. Henley's flashlight caught something in two. Corner, a bundle of tattered cloth. Inside, a child's shoe, a singed doll with a scorched face, and a photo of the Higgins family folded perfectly into a triangle. He took it all back to the station. Lab analysis confirmed what he feared. The doll and shoe belonged to Eliza Higgins, The items had been undisturbed for at least 25 years. But there was more. In a small hollow space beneath the altar table, Henley found records, pages torn from an old register. Names, dates, ages, most were crossed out with red ink. Over 60 names. None matched any known school rosters or birth certificates. It became clear the Higgins family hadn't simply disappeared. They had been part of something, used for something far older than the church itself, something the villagers had kept secret for generations. Next, Sergeant Henley makes a horrifying discovery in the village archives that connects dozens of other missing persons cases across the region, all tracing back to Ashworth. Sergeant Henley didn't sleep the night he returned from the chamber. Instead, he sat alone in the Ashworth constabulary, sorting through every cold case in the county going back to 1920. Runaways, disappearances, open investigations that had quietly gone stale. One by one, he began to see it. A pattern no one had ever connected, or dared to. Over 60 names had been scribbled in the pages beneath that stone altar. The earliest dated 1932, the most recent marked September the 3rd, 1965, the exact day the Higgins family vanished. He searched parish death records, school registers, and census rolls. Many of the children's names were missing entirely from official documents, as if they'd never existed. But some appeared in fragments. A baptism here, a school photo there, a brief mention in a local newspaper under community events. Then silence. One case chilled him. A girl named Clara Densmore, aged 10, last seen in 1948, Ashworth Harvest Festival. Newspaper clipping read, "Young Clara last spotted playing hide-and-seek by the church bell tower. Parents assumed she wandered into the woods. Search parties yielded nothing. The village mourns." Henley checked the altar ledger again. Clara Densmore, entry number 31, her name circled in red, just like Eliza Higgins. He mapped the dates and cross-referenced them with Ashworth's festivals, vigils, and seasonal gatherings. Every 2 to 3 years, like clockwork, a child disappeared, always during a communal event, always quietly explained away. But here was the twist. No public outcry, no media escalation, no protests. In a world increasingly connected and policed, how had this gone unnoticed? He made his way to the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society, an institution founded in 1909 that maintained records of village traditions, folklore, and family trees. On the surface, it was harmless, a local heritage archive. What he found inside shocked him. Old maps of Ashworth marked with cryptic symbols, circles, spirals, X's through certain properties, notes on acceptable bloodlines, mentions of a group known only as the Wardens of the Root, and worst of all, records of who had been chosen, children documented not by name but by lineage, including the Higgins children. Henley took photos of everything. This wasn't random. It was generational, structured, protected. The villagers hadn't forgotten their dead. They had fed them, quietly, periodically, as part of some vile tradition rooted in fear, secrecy, and ritual appeasement. And now, Henley realized something even darker. The Preservation Society wasn't just a historical group, it was the administrative arm of a cult, one that had infiltrated local authority, church leadership, and law enforcement for decades. Next, Henley confronts a retired priest who once served in St. Mary's Church, and what the old man admits forces him to question whether the rituals ever truly stopped. Sergeant Henley drove 2 hours to find him, the Reverend Malcolm Hargreaves, now 86, long retired, and living quietly at a church-run care home in the outskirts of Bristol. For over 30 years, Hargreaves had served as a parish priest in Ashworth, including the crucial period spanning the 1940s to early 1970s. He'd been replaced a year after the Higgins case went cold. Henley wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps another wall of silence, another tired excuse wrapped in scripture. But the moment he showed his badge and whispered the name Ashworth, the old man's face drained of all color. They sat in the care home chapel, Stained glass saints looked down with frozen pity, and after a long, trembling pause, Reverend Hargreaves finally spoke. It was never called St. Mary's, not by them. They called it the Root House. Henley didn't interrupt. He let the old man unburden himself, and what came next was more disturbing than anything found in the crypt. When I first arrived, I thought they were just a quaint, isolated parish, a bit secretive, sure. They kept to old festivals, wore strange robes at night, spoke in whispers about the ancient pact. But it was all under the guise of tradition and preserving the old ways, until I saw the first ceremony. He described it in detail, a candlelit gathering below the church floor, hooded figures surrounding a child who had been blessed, that's the word they used, to be returned to the root. There was no bloodshed in front of him, but what happened after the hymns, he was never allowed to witness. But he heard the screams. They called it the offering of continuance. They believed the land beneath the village was alive, ancient and hungry. They said Ashworth would only thrive if the root was fed. Crops grew, cattle were healthy, disease stayed away, so long as the offering was made. Henley asked why he ever went to the police. Hargreaves just shook his head. There were no police, not really. They had their own. The station reported to the society. The judge, the postmaster, even the butcher, all descendants of the first settlers, bound by oath. I was told to leave it alone or I'd be next. But what broke him, what finally made him retire and vanish? It was the night before the Higgins disappeared. I saw Martha, the mother. She came to me. She begged me to baptize her children in secret. She knew. She was terrified. Said the society had chosen her twins for the ritual that year. I said yes, but the next morning, they were gone. Henley left the care home shaking. It wasn't just a village cult. It was institutional evil, camouflaged by ceremony and executed with terrifying calm. Next, Sergeant Henley uncovers a long-forgotten photograph that proves the society didn't just act alone. They had help from outside Ashworth, from men with national power. Back in Ashworth, Sergeant Henley was running on fumes. Little sleep, a desk cluttered with evidence, and a growing suspicion that this went far beyond a forgotten village ritual. The deeper he dug, the more it felt like something rotten was baked into the very soil of the place, and not just metaphorically. That's when he came across the old society ledger, tucked behind a cabinet in the Preservation Society's archive. Overlooked, dust-choked, sealed with wax that had long since cracked. It was bound in leather and filled with scripted entries in iron gall ink, dating back to the early 1900s. Names, symbols, and, near the center, a folded photograph. Henley unfolded it carefully. It was faded but clear enough to see the faces. A group of men standing in front of St. Mary's. No, the Root House, as Reverend Hargreaves had called it. They were dressed in ceremonial robes holding unlit torches. In the center stood a man in a black coat, not in robes, clearly an outsider, but treated as one of them. Written on the back in delicate cursive, the renewal ceremony, autumn equinox 1951, with gratitude to Sir Edward M. Loughton for services rendered. Henley's heart skipped. Sir Edward Loughton was no local. He was a high-ranking civil servant, once part of the Home Office's Special Affairs Division, a man with real power and connections stretching across multiple counties. The idea that someone of his stature had attended a rural death ritual was unthinkable, or maybe Henley realized that was the point. He dug into Loughton's record. No children. Knighted in 1949, officially retired in 1960, died in 1972, but rumors surrounded him even in death, whispers of involvement in special programs that were buried during wartime. There were no accusations, just gaps. Henley couldn't shake the feeling that Ashworth hadn't just been protected, it had been, sponsored, kept off the national radar, quarantined under the pretense of local heritage. Loughton's presence proved the rot had spread beyond the village. If men like him had been involved, how many others had looked the other way? And more disturbingly, How many more villages were like Ashworth, tucked away in forgotten counties, feeding something ancient in exchange for peace? There was one clue left, a handwritten note tucked into the back of the ledger. It read, "If the root is not fed, it feeds itself. The signs will return, the earth will open." Henley had seen enough to believe it wasn't metaphor, and if the sacrifices had ever stopped, then maybe something worse was coming. Next, we follow Henley as he visits the ruins of a farmhouse just outside Ashworth, a place the society marked as unholy ground and sealed off for decades. What he finds inside changes everything. Just beyond the northern edge of Ashworth, past a crumbling stone wall and overgrown hedgerows, sat the remains of a structure locals only ever referred to as the Blight House. It wasn't listed on any tourist maps, no conservation efforts, no council records. The villagers had pretended it didn't exist, and for good reason. According to the Preservation Society ledger, it had once belonged to the Renshaw family, one of Ashworth's oldest bloodlines. But in 1923, the farmhouse was designated unholy by the society, its land salted and sealed following an incident no one would speak of in detail. Just a single line in the ledger. The containment failed. The root took back what it was owed. Sergeant Henley arrived alone. The drive was silent. Even the birds avoided the place. The farmhouse was half collapsed, its slate roof caved in, the chimney strangled by vines. But beneath the rot, something remained, a sense of pressure, as if the land itself was holding its breath. His boots crunched across brittle earth as he approached the main door, long since kicked in. Inside, dust hung like fog. Rotten furniture, scorched wallpaper, and scattered bones. Animal, but far too many for a place that had been empty for a century. What unnerved Henley most wasn't the decay. It was the symbols. Carved into every surface, door frames, beams, even the underside of window ledges, were arcane runes identical to those found beneath St. Mary's. Some were painted in ochre, others carved deep enough to leave splinters. And in the basement, something worse. A stone circle, blackened with ash. In the center, a cradle. Old. Wooden. Still intact. Henley froze. There were no records of children in the Renshaw family, but here, beneath the farmhouse, was the unmistakable outline of a ritual site. Marks suggested it had been used multiple times, scorched bone fragments embedded. In the floor, bits of charred cloth and a rusted, broken music box resting beside the cradle. It still played when wound. A slow, discordant lullaby echoed through the stone walls. And then Henley saw it. A photograph wedged into the foundation stones behind the cradle. Another group of hooded figures, this time with a child in their arms. The date? 1904. That was 60 years before the Higgins family. Henley realized with a sinking feeling, this had been going on far longer than anyone knew, and the rituals hadn't begun in the church. They'd migrated there after the Renshaw disaster. Ashworth had simply redecorated its evil, dressed it in stone and stained glass. The cradle was empty now, but the land felt hungry. Next, Henley confronts the village's last living link to the original society, a blind midwife whose memory holds the truth about the Higgins twins and what was done to them. Sergeant Henley was running out of living witnesses, but tucked away in a private care home 12 miles outside of Ashworth was one last name tied to the old ledgers, Iris Holloway, now 94 years old and completely blind since 1977. Once the village midwife, she had delivered nearly every child born in Ashworth between 1950 and 1975. She had also been a junior member of the Preservation Society. No visitors, no interviews, just a single relative on file, a nephew in Devon who hadn't spoken to her in decades. But when Henley showed up with a copy of the photo taken beneath the Renshaw farmhouse, the one with the hooded figures and the child, Iris agreed to speak. Her voice was fragile, like dried leaves cracking underfoot, but her memory, uncomfortably intact. "They called it the offering, Inspector," she whispered. "Every generation had to give one, not just blood, but innocence. The child had to be untouched by the world." Henley asked about the Higgins twins. Iris flinched. "They were chosen before they were even born. That family, they weren't real parents, not in the way you think. They were vessels, groomed, brought in. The society had methods." Her words sent a chill through the room. They were trained to appear perfect, church-going, respectable, isolated just enough to raise no questions. The children were acquired through channels no one dared ask about, some local, some not. Henley pressed. Did she know what happened to the twins? Iris lowered her head. "I delivered them. 2 boys, healthy, and then they were taken below, not by me, by them." "Who's them?" he asked. She hesitated. "The keepers, always male, always chosen from Ashworth's oldest families. They kept the chance, the rights. They spoke to the root." She broke down then, a single sob, frail and raw. "We thought it kept the village safe, that the storms would pass us, that the soil would grow richer, the livestock would thrive. For a time, it did." Henley laid the photo on her lap. "This child," he asked, "from 1904, who is he?" Iris reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the paper with haunting familiarity. Then, in a whisper that barely escaped her lips, "That's my brother." Henley stared. "He was taken at the equinox. I was 6. My mother offered him, said he was born with the gift." She wept the whole time. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ashworth hadn't just buried its past. It had fed it, generation after generation. The Higgins twins weren't the beginning. They were part of a long, secret harvest. And now, Henley had a name. The Keepers. And a location Iris feared even more than the church or the farmhouse. Next, Henley visits a sealed vault beneath Ashworth Town Hall, once the Society's meeting chamber. What he finds carved into the walls may finally reveal what the root truly was. The Ashworth Town Hall was built in 1812, but few realized its foundations were far older, resting atop the remains of a 17th century moot hall used by village elders to settle disputes, draft charters, and, as Sergeant Henley would discover, conduct far darker gatherings. With Iris Holloway's trembling warning still echoing in his head, Henley pulled council records and uncovered blueprints revealing an unmarked sub-basement, sealed off since 1966 under the vague label, "structurally unsound." It had never been reopened. No inspections, no documentation, just silence. Getting in required a quiet favor from a sympathetic clerk, a young woman whose grandfather had died mysteriously after attending a Preservation Society meeting in 1972. She gave Henley a key, but no words, only a look that said, "Don't stay long." The entrance lay behind a false panel in the archives room. The stairwell that descended beneath the hall was tight, cold, and pitch dark, choked with dust and the unmistakable scent of old stone and burnt wax. When Henley reached the bottom, he entered a circular chamber of crumbling brick, but it wasn't the decay that froze him. It was what was carved into every single surface. Dozens, no, hundreds of sigils, dates, and names, etched in a style identical to the runes found in the Renshaw basement and St. Mary's secret chapel. But here they were intertwined, forming a spiral that wound from the outer walls inward, all converging on a single symbol in the center of the stone floor, the root. Not a word, but a drawing. A twisted tree with no leaves. Its branches were sharp, almost claw-like, but its roots, they weren't roots. They were people. Bodies. Children. Faces turned upwards in agony. In the middle of the spiral, Henley found a raised stone plinth, blackened with soot and worn by what appeared to be repeated scraping, set into the bay. This was a brass plaque. From ash through blood, from blood to bounty, from bounty back to ash. There were no lights, no electricity, but Henley could sense that this place had not been abandoned willingly. He placed a hand on the wall and immediately recoiled. The stone was warm. And the silence? It wasn't quiet. Not really. There was a faint hum, like something below was still breathing, or waiting. He took photos of everything. The carvings, the central symbol, the spiral of names. Many matched the society's old registers, but one set of names stood out, repeated across the walls. Higgins, James. Higgins, Evelyn. Higgins, Daniel. Higgins, Matthew. Not just the parents and twins, but at least 4 others with the same surname. No records mentioned them. Henley realized the Higgins family didn't lose 2 children. They lost 6. Next, a visit to Ashworth Cemetery, where unmarked graves and disturbed earth hinted how deep the society's sacrifices truly went. By now, Sergeant Henley had uncovered enough to charge half the village council with obstruction of justice, but none of it explained the full scale of what happened in Ashworth, or how many lives were truly lost under the guise of tradition. The answers, it seemed, were no longer in records, but in the ground itself. Ashworth Cemetery sits on the edge of the village, bordered by dense woodland. Locals avoided it after dusk, and not just out of superstition. Over the decades, families had quietly moved their loved ones' remains elsewhere, not because they feared the dead, but because they feared who was buried with them. Henley obtained an old plot map from 1931, faded and water-stained. It listed hundreds of graves, many now unmarked. When he compared it to the current cemetery layout, 47 graves were missing, not moved, not destroyed, just erased. A local groundskeeper, John Bell, had worked there for over 40 years. When Henley asked him about the missing plots, Bell's face changed. He didn't deny it. He just asked, "You sure you really want to know?" Bell led Henley to the far northern edge, where bramble and ivy had swallowed entire rows. He pointed to what looked like uneven patches of soil, sunken in places. "That's the old W section," Bell muttered. "Society burials, no headstones. Families were told to keep quiet, for the good of the village." Henley knelt and gently brushed away leaves and dirt. Beneath one hollowed dip, he found a chunk of worn limestone, the top of a headstone buried deliberately. Scratched into it, barely legible. Higgins, Miriam, B. 1953, D. 1957. Another, Higgins, Ruth, B. 1955, D. 1955. 2 more names, 2 more children, both dead before the age of 5. No birth records, no death certificates. Just stones buried under weeds and silence. Henley kept digging, carefully, methodically. By the end of the night, he had uncovered 5 more hidden headstones, all belonging to children surnamed Higgins, all born between 1948 and 1962. Some had only first names, some had none at all. One simply read, "The Chosen." Bell wouldn't stay after sundown. He left Henley with a warning: "The ground here, it remembers, and it don't like to be disturbed." That night, Henley sat in his car, staring at the growing list of Higgins children no one ever mentioned. The public believed James and Evelyn Higgins adopted 2 boys. The records showed 12. The cemetery suggested at least 8 were dead before the twins ever arrived. This wasn't a story of adoption gone wrong. It was a farm for flesh. And the crops were children. Next, Henley uncovers coded documents from the society archives, revealing a chilling ledger system used to value each child according to a ritual calendar. Back at his station, Sergeant Henley placed the cemetery photos side by side with society minutes, birth records, and those strange documents from beneath the town hall. The names lined up far too neatly to ignore, but something was still missing. A system, a logic to the horror. And then, in the back of an unlabeled file, he found it. A ledger bound in cracked leather, with no title on the cover. Inside, columns of dates, initials, and cryptic phrases, many in Latin, some in Old English. At first glance, it looked like an account book, but instead of currency, it tracked children. Each entry was marked by a date, followed by codes like Rude Moon, 2 Taken, GHLF, or Offering, Higgins, M, Barren Line. Every April and October, the entries intensified, and at the top of those pages, always the same symbol, the root. Henley cross-referenced the initials with school registers and census data. It was painstaking work, but within hours he had 16 confirmed names, all children who had disappeared from Ashworth between 1940 and 1975. Their disappearances had always been explained away: fires, illness, families moving overnight, but here they were, listed as offerings. The most chilling entry read, Harvest, 1965, full yield achieved, the Higgins seed has taken. It wasn't a record. It was a ritual log. Each child was valued based on bloodline, age, and, horrifyingly, perceived purity. Phrases like unspoiled, second-born, and unbaptized appeared beside certain names. A separate symbol, a small I, denoted those considered watchers or sensitive to the veil. Henley's blood ran cold. These weren't random killings. This was an organized spiritual economy, and the children were currency. What's more, the ledger didn't stop in 1965. The last full entry was from 1984, nearly 20 years after the Higgins case. Even after the post-collapse of the Historical Preservation Society, the rituals had continued, just more quietly, more selectively. Tucked in the final pages was a single note, written in a different, more frantic hand. When the bough breaks, the root will return. Watch the twin moons. Henley copied the entire ledger by hand. The original, he later learned, was lost during an internal police reshuffling. But what he saw never left him. He knew now that Ashworth wasn't unique. The society had branches in at least 3 other counties. But Ashworth had been the seedbed, the nursery of the root. And the children buried beneath its church and its soil were not just victims, they were investments. Next, Henley attempts to confront the village elders and finds that those who kept the secrets aren't afraid of the truth, because they still serve something older than justice. Sergeant Henley had enough evidence to make arrests, enough to warrant national attention, but he was about to learn that some truths, especially in Ashworth, weren't just buried, they were guarded. He returned to Ashworth on a rainy Thursday evening in September, determined to confront the surviving elders who had once sat on the Historical Preservation Society. Many were now in their 80s and 90s, tucked away in well-kept cottages, sipping tea as if their pasts were blameless. Henley began with Eleanor Voss, once the Society's secretary, and by all accounts the most respectable woman in the village. She answered the door in a floral dressing gown, her face serene. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, as if expecting him. Inside her cottage nothing seemed unusual. Doilies, framed photos, a small wooden cross above the fireplace. But as Henley mentioned the ledger, Eleanor's demeanor shifted, not to fear, but to calm defiance. "You misunderstand," she said softly. "The root isn't evil. It's balance. It's sacrifice for survival. The children were chosen long before we ever touched them." Henley froze. "You're admitting this? That you offered them?" Eleanor tilted her head. "We didn't take them. We returned them, back to where we all come from. Before you judge, ask yourself, why do you think no war ever touched this village? Why no plague ever lingered here? We gave so others could live." Her words were rehearsed, almost ritualistic. It wasn't confession, It was doctrine. When Henley pressed further, Eleanor grew colder. "You should leave this alone, Sergeant. Some truths are bigger than you, and the root still feeds." Before he left, he noticed something odd on her mantel. A carved wooden sculpture, half human, half tree, arms outstretched like twisted branches. Beneath it, etched into the base, "He who roots rules over the knee." 2 days, he visited 5 more elders. All gave similar responses, vague, circular justifications, wrapped in layers of denial and reverence. One even said, "Would you rather starve in darkness or thrive in bloodlight?" None denied the ledger, none denied the children. They just didn't see it as murder. Henley tried to rally support from his superiors, but pressure began to mount. His requests were delayed, emails vanished, evidence misplaced. Whispers started about his mental health, his obsession, his vendetta against Ashworth. Someone was silencing the truth, not just villagers, but people above him. That's when he found the second set of burial records. They weren't just for Ashworth. They were for 3 other villages, all tied to the Society's old network, all showing the same patterns: adoptions, disappearances, false causes of death. Ashworth hadn't been the end. It was the prototype. Next, Henley is warned off the case in a chilling message left at his home, and what's written on it connects directly to the darkest part of the Higgins property, now sealed and forgotten. 3 nights after his final visit to Ashworth, Sergeant Henley returned home to find his front door slightly ajar. He lived alone. No one had a key. Inside, everything looked untouched at first. No signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no stolen files. But on the kitchen table, something waited for him. Something simple and deeply disturbing. A small wooden box, handmade, stained with something dark and old. No note, no fingerprints, no sound. Just the quiet hum of his refrigerator and the distant sound of rain. He opened it. Inside, a lump of blackened ash, mixed with what looked like crushed bone fragments, and a photograph. A photograph of the Higgins children, sitting on the church steps in their Sunday best, smiling. Scrawled across their faces in red ink, "You've seen too much. Let the root rest." Beneath that, a phrase written in Latin, the same one he'd seen in the Society's ledger, "Ad radicem redeunt omnia." All things return to the root. Henley staggered back. He wasn't scared. He was furious. Someone had entered his home, not to hurt him physically, but to remind him they were still watching, still capable, still protected. And that box of ash, he knew exactly what it meant. During the early investigation, he'd sealed off the sub-basement chamber beneath St. Mary's Church, the ritual site where the Higgins' final possessions had been found. That room had been classified as evidence. No one was supposed to go back down there. Yet the ash in that box was identical to the scorched remnants from the sacrificial circle beneath the altar. Someone had returned to that room, possibly even reused it. Henley drove straight to Ashworth. The church doors were locked, lights off, grounds silent. But when he approached the eastern wall, the one where he'd once found claw marks hidden behind the choir stalls, he noticed fresh soil at the not just disturbed, but turned. Someone had dug, then recovered a portion of the foundation. He marked the spot, took photos, and returned before dawn with 2 forensic officers. What they uncovered beneath the floor shocked even the most seasoned of them. A new ritual circle, not ancient, not from the 60s, recent. At the center, a small burned rag doll pinned to the ground with iron nails, around it teeth. Not animal, not adult, child-sized. Whoever left the box at Henley's home wasn't threatening him out of fear. They were warning him because the rituals had begun again. And this time it wasn't just about the past. It was about keeping the root alive. Next, Henley receives an unexpected call from a woman claiming to be a survivor, someone who says she was meant to die with the Higgins children, but escaped. What she reveals will crack the case wide open. The call came just after 3 o'clock a.m. Henley was at his desk reviewing forensic reports from the ritual site beneath St. Mary's. His eyes were red, his coffee cold, his patience hanging by a thread. The number was unlisted, the voice on the other end, shaky but deliberate. "You don't know me, but I think you've been looking for me." Henley didn't respond immediately. "I was one of the Higgins children, sort of. My name isn't on any record, because they never really adopted me." The voice trembled again, then steadied. "I was brought there for something else." Her name was Lydia May Carrow. She claimed to have been taken in by the Higgins family for a trial stay sometime in the spring of 1965. She was 8. No official paperwork. No agency placement. Just a quiet arrangement made through a friend of the church. Henley knew that name, Carrow. It had shown up in the second ledger, but listed under non-initiate, a phrase no one had been able to decode. Lydia continued, "I wasn't supposed to stay. I think they knew I